It was Halloween night, and like every year, the streets were alive with children in costumes, parents half-heartedly holding on to plastic pumpkin buckets, and the faint sound of laughter carried by the cool autumn wind. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the air had that unmistakable bite to it, promising winter just around the corner. But this Halloween felt different. There was something about the sky, an unnatural shade of gray, a thick ceiling of clouds hanging low, as if the heavens were keeping secrets. I brushed it off at first. It was just another evening, another round of costumes and candy. What could go wrong? Then came the clowns. It started around 6 p.m. They began showing up at doorsteps, their painted faces frozen in wide, grotesque grins, their eyes unblinking under brightly colored wigs. Some stood silently, holding balloons or small paper-wrapped candies, and others stood in still, eerie clusters at the ends of streets. At first, the town didn't think much of it. Halloween had always been a night of playful scares, and this seemed like an elaborate prank. But something was off, and we could all feel it. The first scream came from across the street, a piercing, blood-curdling cry that echoed between the rows of houses. It was followed by silence, a stillness that swallowed the sounds of the night. A few neighbors ran toward the house, but the scream's source was nowhere to be found. No one could say where the woman had gone, but a clown stood at the end of her driveway, staring at the sky, motionless. More clowns appeared as the evening wore on. They didn't speak. They didn't laugh or chase. They just watched, eyes painted black like hollow pits of darkness, their smiles wide and fixed. I remember the exact moment I knew something was wrong. One of the clowns, his face a twisted mockery of a smile, smeared red lips too large for any human face, stood at the window of my house. He just stared, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the glass. Not a word, not a gesture, just that unyielding, grotesque gaze. I thought about calling the police, but my hands shook too much to dial the number. Besides, what could I tell them? A clown was at my window? It sounded ridiculous in my head, but my gut told me something was terribly, horribly wrong. The atmosphere grew heavy. The air turned thick, and the once harmless laughter outside had died, replaced by the occasional scream or desperate cry. I couldn't sit by any longer. I stepped outside to find out what was happening. The streets were quiet now, deserted except for the clowns. They were everywhere, silent, watching, like they were waiting for something, but for what? I couldn't tell. I saw one man, the baker from down the street, approach one of the clowns. He thought it was a joke. He thought maybe he could scare them off. As he moved closer, the clown turned slowly toward him. The baker reached out to touch the clown's shoulder, laughing nervously. That was when I saw it, the clown's face. It cracked. The paint didn't flake like you'd expect from old makeup. No, it splintered like porcelain. And beneath the crack, something moved. Something alive. The clown grabbed the baker's wrist, twisting it with an unnatural strength, bending it back with a sickening snap that echoed down the street. The baker screamed, and before I could blink, the clown dragged him off into the darkness. I froze, unable to move. That's when the reality of the situation finally hit me. These weren't people in costumes. They weren't playing dress-up or pranking the neighborhood. They were something else entirely. I bolted back to my house, locking the door behind me. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I couldn't stay there. I couldn't hide. The town was under attack, and whatever those clowns were, they had plans. Plans that involved us. I grabbed a kitchen knife, hoping to God it would be enough, and turned to leave. But when I reached for the doorknob, I hesitated. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow just beyond the hallway window. One of them was watching me, standing there, waiting. I could feel its eyes on me, and for a moment I thought I saw its mouth twitch. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The streets were filled with them now. Every corner I turned, there was a clown standing, staring, waiting. Some were dragging their victims toward the woods at the edge of town. The clowns didn't just take people. They took children, families, anyone who crossed their path. Where they were going, I couldn't tell. But I had no intention of finding out. I headed toward the center of town, hoping I wasn't the only one left. Maybe there were others like me, hiding, waiting for a chance to fight back. But the closer I got, the more I realized something terrifying. The clowns weren't just standing still anymore. They were moving, fast and silently, like shadows in the night. That's when I saw the carnival. It had appeared overnight, standing in the middle of the field beyond the school. Its lights flickered ominously in the distance, casting an eerie glow over the town. A large, blood-red tent dominated the landscape, and from within, I could hear the faint sound of carnival music playing, slow, distorted, almost mournful. I should have run. I should have turned back. But something drew me closer. It was like the music had wrapped itself around my mind, pulling me forward step by step. As I approached, the clowns lined the path, silent, unblinking. They parted as I moved between them, leading me toward the tent as if this was where they'd wanted me to go all along. Inside the tent, the air was thick and suffocating, the smell of stale popcorn and something far worse clinging to the fabric walls. At the center of the ring stood a figure, taller than any clown I had seen so far. Its grin was wider, more malicious, its eyes empty voids. It raised a hand, and from the shadows they came, and I realized this was just the beginning. The moment the figure raised its hand, the clowns began to close in. Their footsteps were impossibly silent, the ground beneath their oversized shoes making no sound, no crunch of dirt, no rustle of the fabric that hung loosely on their bodies. It was as if they floated toward me, drawn by some unseen force. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. It was like the ground had become part of me, holding me down. The carnival lights flickered above, casting long, jittery shadows that danced around the tent, making everything feel like a waking nightmare. The clowns were everywhere now, their twisted faces slowly closing in, their painted smiles hiding something far more sinister underneath. In the center of the ring, the tall figure stood unmoving, its gaze fixed on me, as if waiting. I was caught in its grip, a coldness spreading through my limbs, making it impossible to look away. The music, God, that awful music, had grown louder, more discordant, like a broken calliope winding down but never quite stopping. It throbbed in my head, a mocking, nightmarish waltz that turned the air heavy. Suddenly, the tall figure tilted its head, and the lights flickered off, plunging the entire carnival into pitch-black darkness. I blinked, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I couldn't see anything, just blackness pressing in on all sides. The tent was gone. The clowns were gone. For a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, it was all in my head. Maybe I was losing it. But then I heard it, that sound. A giggle, high-pitched, childlike, and close. Far too close. It echoed in the dark, bouncing around me, followed by another laugh, this one deeper, throatier. Then came the rustling of movement, like fabric brushing against skin. The darkness wasn't empty. They were still here, somewhere. I could feel their eyes on me, sense their breath as they hovered just out of sight. And with that giggling came the scraping sound, faint but unmistakable, metal against metal, sharp and rhythmic. A spotlight flicked on, illuminating the ring. The tall figure was gone, but in its place, a small figure stood hunched over. My stomach twisted as the light revealed what it was. A child, no more than 7 or 8 years old, dressed in the same garish clown outfit as the others. But this one wasn't smiling. Its face was smeared with red paint. The colors streaked and distorted, as if it had been crying. In its hand, the child held a balloon, a large, sagging thing that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And from the balloon came the sound of scratching, nails scraping against its taut surface. The child giggled again, its head tilting unnaturally to the side, its eyes wide and empty. Then it spoke. "Do you want to play?" The word sent a jolt of ice down my spine. There was something wrong with its voice, something not human. It was layered, as if 2 or 3 voices were speaking in unison, overlapping in strange, disjointed harmony. I shook my head, taking a step back. My hand tightened around the knife in my pocket, though I had no idea what good it would do against this thing. The child tilted its head further, its neck cracking audibly, and the giggle turned into a low, bubbling growl. The balloon popped, and in that instant, the lights came back on. I froze. The clowns were back, all of them. But they weren't standing anymore. They were hanging, suspended in the air by thick ropes tied around their necks, swaying gently as if caught in an invisible breeze. Their painted faces were smeared, dripping like wax, their grins wider now, stretched to inhuman proportions. And their eyes were open, staring down at me, black and hollow. They weren't dead, but they weren't alive either. They were something in between, something far worse. A shrill metallic creak broke the silence as a swing, dangling from nowhere, appeared in the center of the ring. Sitting on it, swinging back and forth, was the tall figure. Its head was bowed, the top hat resting on its head, tilting with each slow movement of the swing. As it lifted its head, those empty voids for eyes locked onto me again. The clowns started to move, their bodies twitching, jerking in the air as if pulled by unseen strings. The sound of bones cracking, popping, and rearranging echoed through the tent. Their legs bent unnaturally, their arms stretching too long, too thin. They were no longer pretending to be human. I turned to run, but before I could take more than a few steps, something cold wrapped around my ankle, something rough and tight, like rope. I looked down and to my horror a hand, pale and bony, was reaching out from beneath the dirt floor of the tent. It yanked me down with terrifying strength, dragging me across the ground as the clowns loomed closer, their bodies stretching grotesquely, their jaws unhinging. I kicked, struggling to free myself, but the grip tightened, pulling me toward the center of the ring, toward the swing, toward the tall figure that had stopped swinging now, its head tilting in curiosity. The clowns laughed, a shrill, piercing chorus that rose above the discordant music. I thrashed, trying to claw my way free, but it was no use. The hand beneath the dirt pulled harder, dragging me toward the waiting figures. As I was dragged into the center of the ring, the tall figure bent down, leaning in close. Its grin widened impossibly, the skin of its face pulling back to reveal rows of jagged, sharp teeth. It whispered, its voice a rasping hiss, "You're next." The lights flickered once, twice, and then everything went black again. I was falling, plummeting into the void beneath the dirt, and I realized with a sickening dread that I wasn't falling alone. Something was down here, something far worse than the clowns above. I screamed, but no sound came. Only the darkness and the laughter of the clowns echoed as I was swallowed by the earth. When I woke, I was somewhere else. The air was thick, musty, like I was buried beneath layers of rot and decay. The ground under me wasn't dirt anymore. It was soft, spongy, like flesh. The scent hit me before I could even gather my thoughts, the unmistakable stench of death. My eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light, flickering like a dying candle. Everything was distorted, the space around me bending at impossible angles. I wasn't in the carnival anymore. I tried to move, but something heavy pressed down on my chest, pinning me in place. Panic surged through my veins, and I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision. My fingers scraped against the soft ground, and that's when I realized this wasn't just soil. It was covered in a sticky, congealed substance that clung to my skin. I looked around, squinting in the dim light, and my stomach churned. Bodies. Dozens of them, maybe more, stacked haphazardly around me like discarded dolls. Their faces were painted like clowns, grotesque and twisted, but the paint had smeared, mixing with blood and something black that oozed from their skin. Some of the bodies twitched, small involuntary spasms as if they weren't quite dead, or maybe they were, and something else was controlling them. I gagged, bile rising in my throat, and forced myself to stand. Every inch of me ached, my muscles sore from being dragged God knows how far into this pit. The weight on my chest lifted and I stumbled to my feet, my head swimming with dizziness. I had to get out. A faint sound echoed through the chamber, soft, distant like the hum of machinery. It was coming from above. My eyes trailed up and I saw it. A faint opening high above me through which a sliver of light shone. It was the only way out, but there was no way I could reach it. The walls were slick, covered in that same black tar-like substance that seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. Then I heard it again. That laugh. High-pitched, childlike, but wrong. It echoed through the chamber, bouncing off the walls, disorienting me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to pinpoint the source. A figure emerged from the shadows. At first I thought it was one of the clowns, a small, hunched figure, dressed in ragged clown attire. But as it drew closer, I saw the truth. It wasn't a clown. It wasn't even human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tight over its bones. Its eyes were wide, sunken black holes, devoid of anything human. Its mouth was twisted into a permanent grin, teeth too sharp, too long, protruding from cracked lips. It crawled on all fours, its limbs unnaturally long, moving with a jerky, insect-like precision. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat, but it was no use. The thing was fast, too fast. Before I could even blink, it was in front of me, its face inches from mine, those black eyes staring into my soul. It tilted its head, the grin widening. It whispered in that same layered voice I'd heard before, the voices overlapping in a sickening symphony of madness. "Come play with us." I froze. The words sent a jolt of terror through me, and before I could react, it lunged. I screamed and threw myself to the side, narrowly avoiding its outstretched claws. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, running blindly through the pit of bodies. My legs felt like they were moving through molasses, but I pushed forward, adrenaline driving me. The thing let out a high-pitched screech, its claws scraping against the ground as it pursued me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My mind was focused on one thing: survival. I stumbled over a body, crashing to the ground. Pain shot through my knees, but I pushed myself up, my hands covered in that sickening black substance. The thing was close now, its breath hot against the back of my neck. I could feel it, reaching for me, its claws grazing my skin. And then, just as its fingers closed around my ankle, the laughter stopped. Everything stopped. I turned, panting, my heart racing. The creature had frozen in place, its head twisted at an impossible angle, eyes staring blankly ahead. And then, slowly, it began to dissolve. Its body crumbled, turning to ash, scattering in the air like dust. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. What the hell was happening? That's when I saw him. The tall figure, standing at the edge of the pit, watching me. Its grin was wider now, stretching from ear to ear, teeth gleaming in the dim light. It wasn't just the leader of the clowns, it was something far worse. Something ancient, something evil. It raised its hand and the bodies around me began to stir. They moved slowly at first, twitching, convulsing. Then one by one they stood. Their painted faces were smeared with blood, their eyes vacant, and they turned to face me. I backed away, my mind racing for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The tall figure stepped forward, its voice echoing through the chamber. "You belong to us now." I shook my head, stumbling backward. No, this couldn't be happening. This wasn't real, but it was. The clowns, the bodies. They were closing in on me, their movements slow, deliberate, like puppets on strings. My back hit the wall, and I realized, with a sickening dread, that there was no way out, no escape. And then I heard it, a voice. Faint but clear, it was my voice. From somewhere deep within the pile of bodies, I heard myself calling out. The sound echoed in my ears, chilling me to the core. I looked around, panic setting in, but I was alone, alone with the clowns and the tall figure, alone with the impossible truth. I was already dead, and this was only the beginning. The realization hit me like a freight train. Dead. I was already dead. But how? How could this be? I felt the blood in my veins, the air in my lungs, but that voice, my voice, called out from somewhere beneath the pile of bodies, echoing through the chamber of grotesque clowns. Everything about this place felt wrong, distorted, like reality itself had been torn apart and stitched back together in some nightmarish patchwork. The tall figure grinned wider, if that was even possible, its voice hissing through the air. "You understand now, don't you? You were always meant to join us, but there's no need to fight. You'll be one of us soon." The clowns moved closer, the bodies surrounding me, their eyes empty pits of darkness, their smiles more sinister than ever. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, the grip of death tightening, pulling me deeper into this hellish reality. But something deep inside me, a spark, a flicker, refused to give in. No, this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The walls of the pit seemed to pulse, the flesh-like ground beneath me throbbing with some sort of unnatural rhythm. The bodies crept closer, but as they did, something stirred in me. That voice, my voice, the one that had called out from the darkness, echoed louder now, clearer. It wasn't calling me to surrender. It was calling me to fight. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus, to think past the terror. If I was truly dead, then what did I have to lose? There was something here, something buried deep in this nightmarish landscape, and I had to find it. I had to understand. Maybe, just maybe, I could change my fate. With a sudden burst of determination, I pushed past the bodies, breaking free from their cold, lifeless hands. The tall figure watched me, its smile faltering for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossing its featureless face. I ran toward the pile of bodies, toward the place where I had heard my own voice. I clawed at the black, sticky flesh, ripping through the layers of decay and death. The clowns screeched behind me, their twisted faces contorting in rage as they lurched forward, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And then I found it. Beneath the mound of bodies, deep in the black ooze, was something glowing. A soft, golden light, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as they brushed against its warmth. As soon as I touched it, the world around me shifted. The pit disappeared. The clowns, the tall figure, the grotesque carnival, they all vanished in an instant, leaving only darkness and that golden light. The air was still, peaceful, almost serene. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt calm. The light grew brighter, enveloping me in its warmth, and suddenly, I understood. This wasn't death, not truly. This was a liminal space, a place between life and death, between reality and nightmare. The clowns, the tall figure, they weren't real. They were manifestations of something darker, something that fed on fear and despair, trapping those who lost hope in its twisted grip. But I hadn't lost hope. Not yet. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the light wash over me. The terror, the panic, it melted away, replaced by a sense of peace, of clarity. I had a choice. I didn't have to stay here. I didn't have to become one of them. The light pulsed once more, and then, like a breath of fresh air, it surged through me. I felt it. Life, real life, coursing back into my body, filling every inch of me with warmth, with energy. The darkness shattered, and in its place, I saw the world again. I opened my eyes. I was back in my house. The kitchen, the walls, the windows, everything was just as it had been before the clowns appeared. The air was still, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I blinked, disoriented but alive. The memory of the pit, of the clowns and the carnival lingered at the edge of my mind, but it felt distant now, like a bad dream fading with the morning light. I stood up, my legs shaky but solid, and made my way to the window. Outside, the street was quiet. No clowns, no chaos, just the faint sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Halloween was over. I smiled, a real, genuine smile. Somehow I had made it. I had escaped. But as I turned away from the window, I noticed something on the ground, just outside my door. A balloon, red and sagging, tied to a small card. With trembling hands, I opened the door and picked up the card. It read, "See you next year." For a moment, fear tightened in my chest. But then I crumpled the card and let it fall to the ground. Whatever that was, whatever evil had tried to claim me, it was gone now. And I wasn't afraid anymore. I had won.